Your crimes have gone unpunished for too long. Tonight, in front of all these people, you will face the truth.
My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 54 years old. 3 months ago, my mother stood at the podium of the Hargrove Community Hospital Gala, looked directly at me across a room of 400 people, and asked, aloud, into a live microphone whether I had come to beg for my invitation back. She did not recognize me. The diamond earrings she was wearing, I should mention, had been a gift from my grandmother. The same grandmother who, 14 years ago, had quietly signed a document that would change everything. The room went very still. My mother's face, a moment later, went white as the tablecloths. If you have ever been the family member they counted out, the one they called a disappointment while someone else received the applause, stay with me. Like and subscribe if this story feels like something you need to hear. Drop your city and the time where you are in the comments. I find comfort knowing you are there. Flashback and family hierarchy, the Ellison family, occupied a particular kind of standing in Hargrove, Ohio. The kind built not on old money, but on the performance of it. Margaret's father, Robert Ellison, managed the regional branch of a national bank and wore his position the way other men wore expensive watches, constantly, and with the expectation that everyone noticed. Her mother, Diane, chaired 3 charitable committees and hosted dinners where the floral arrangements cost more than the food. Appearances were the Ellison family religion, and Sunday service never ended. Margaret was the second of 2 daughters. Her sister, Claire, was 22 months older, blonde in the way their mother had always wanted to be, and possessed of an easy social grace that translated effortlessly into the currency their parents valued most, admiration from other people. Claire played piano at recitals their parents attended in the front row. Claire was elected homecoming queen in 1987, and Robert Ellison told the story to strangers at dinner parties for 11 years afterward. Margaret was quiet. She preferred books to recitals. She earned better grades than Claire, but grades were not a performance, and so they did not register. She went to school on a partial academic scholarship. Her parents could have covered the full tuition and chose not to, though they paid Claire's room, board, and a generous spending account without discussion. The one person who saw Margaret clearly was her maternal grandmother, Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor was 71 at the time Margaret left for college and lived 40 minutes away in a house that smelled of cedar and bread. She kept a small wooden desk in her study where she wrote letters by hand, and every few weeks a letter arrived for Margaret, not a card, a letter. 3 or 4 pages of careful cursive observing the world and asking genuine questions about Margaret's life. It was Eleanor who, during the Christmas of Margaret's junior year, pressed an envelope into her hand at the end of a visit and said only, "Keep this somewhere safe, and don't show your mother." Margaret tucked the envelope into the lining of her winter coat. She did not open it until she was back in her dormitory room, sitting cross-legged on her narrow bed. Inside was a business card, a law firm in Columbus, a partner named James Whitfield, and a handwritten note that said, "When the time comes, call him. He knows what to do. I love you more than you know." Margaret placed the card in the small fireproof box where she kept her passport and her birth certificate. She did not call the number for 12 years. Mistreatment montage the pattern arrived in installments, each one small enough to be explained away, each one leaving a deposit behind. The summer Margaret turned 16, she was accepted into a regional mathematics program at Ohio State. 2 weeks of intensive coursework, a certificate, a letter of recommendation from a university professor. She mentioned it at dinner on a Tuesday evening. Her father nodded once and said that was fine, as long as she was back in time for Claire's graduation party. Her mother asked whether the program had a dress code and whether she'd need anything ironed. Neither of them mentioned it again. When Margaret returned home with the certificate, she put it in her desk drawer. It stayed there. Christmas of 1991. Margaret was 19 and home from her first semester. She had carried a 3.9 GPA. She had been invited to join an honors research cohort in the spring. She sat at the holiday dinner table and waited for the moment to share the news, and then her mother raised a glass and said she wanted to acknowledge what a remarkable year Claire had had. The new apartment, the new boyfriend, the promotion at the real estate firm. The table applauded. Margaret refilled her water glass. She did not mention the honors cohort. 3 years later, in the spring of 1994, Margaret graduated from Ohio State with a degree in biochemistry and a letter of acceptance to a master's program in healthcare administration at Johns Hopkins. She had applied without telling her parents. She had secured her own funding. When she finally told them, her father's response was measured. "Baltimore is very far away." Her mother said she hoped Margaret wasn't planning to be one of those women who put a career ahead of everything else. Then her mother asked whether Claire's boyfriend had proposed yet. because someone at the club had mentioned seeing them looking at rings. Margaret drove to Baltimore 6 weeks later with her textbooks in the back seat and $400 in her checking account. She did not hear from her parents for 3 months. When her mother finally called, it was to ask if Margaret was coming home for Thanksgiving, because they needed the head count for the caterer. Inciting incident, October 11th, 2003, a Saturday, cool and overcast, the kind of autumn day that turns the light thin and gray by 3 in the afternoon. Margaret was 35. She had been living in Columbus for 4 years by then, working as director of development for a regional healthcare nonprofit. She had built something, modestly, carefully, without announcement. She owned a small house, she had a savings account, and a work history that had earned her the quiet respect of serious people. She drove to Hargrove for what her mother had called a family lunch. No occasion was given. When she arrived, she found Claire already seated at the dining room table, and both her parents arranged in the particular way they arranged themselves when they had decided something in advance. Her father did the talking. He explained that he and Diane had decided to restructure the family finances before retirement. They had consulted an advisor. They had determined that the most efficient course was to transfer the bulk of their investment assets to Claire, who would manage them going forward, as Claire had demonstrated greater financial stability and, frankly, a better sense of what the family stood for. Margaret asked quietly what that meant for her. Her mother looked at her hands and said that Margaret had always been very independent, that she had chosen her own path, that it would not be fair to Claire to divide things equally when the effort had been so unequal. Claire said nothing. She looked at the centerpiece. Margaret sat with that for a moment. The house was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. She asked one more question, whether this was final. Her father said it was. Margaret folded her napkin and placed it on the table. She said, simply, that she understood. She retrieved her coat from the hook by the door. She drove home in the gray October light, and she did not cry until she was inside her own house, with the door closed. And then she sat on the kitchen floor for a long time without moving. 3 days later, she called the number on the business card. Strategic Preparation James Whitfield answered on the second ring. He was 63, unhurried, and did not seem surprised to hear from her. He said that Eleanor Marsh had spoken with him at length some years before her death, and that he had been wondering when Margaret would call. Eleanor had died in 1999. Margaret had not known until that phone call that her grandmother had done anything beyond give her a business card. She drove to Columbus the following Thursday. James Whitfield's office occupied the 3rd floor of a building near the Capitol, and his desk was stacked with folders arranged in a system that only he understood. He set one folder in front of Margaret and waited while she read. In 1996, Eleanor Marsh had established an irrevocable trust. Its assets included a substantial investment portfolio, 2 commercial properties in central Ohio, and a private equity stake that Eleanor had quietly accumulated over 20 years through the proceeds of a small industrial company her late husband had founded. By 2003, the combined value of the trust had grown to just over $9 million. Margaret Ellison was the sole beneficiary. The trust had been structured to release fully upon Margaret's 35th birthday or upon Eleanor's death, whichever came later. Margaret had turned 35 in August. She read the document twice. Then she sat with her hands in her lap for a long time. She told James Whitfield that she didn't want to do anything rash. He said he would not recommend rash. He said the assets were hers. They had been hers for 2 months already, and what she did with them was entirely her decision. He suggested she take a few weeks and then come back with questions. She took 8 weeks. She met with a financial advisor named Ruth Candela, a woman in her late 50s who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and asked direct questions without apology. She reviewed the portfolio. She reviewed the properties. She did not tell her parents or her sister. She did not tell anyone except Ruth and James. The doubt arrived at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in December. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink, and she considered, seriously, whether to simply do nothing, whether to take the inheritance and live her life quietly and let the distance between herself and her family settle into something permanent and unremarkable. She thought about Eleanor's letters, the careful cursive, the genuine questions. She picked up a notepad and began to write. Not a plan, not yet, just a list of what she actually wanted. By January, the picture had clarified. She had decided to use a portion of the trust to establish a healthcare development fund. She had identified a capital project, an expansion wing at Hargrove Community Hospital, the institution that had served the county for 60 years and had been trying for a decade to fund a dedicated oncology unit. The project had stalled for lack of a lead donor. The amount needed was $10 million. Margaret met with the hospital's executive director in February. She brought Ruth and James. She asked that her identity as the primary donor be held in confidence until a naming ceremony, which was standard practice for gifts of this scale. The director agreed. Margaret signed the commitment letter in March. She then called an interior designer, enrolled in a public speaking course, and bought 2 suits that fit her correctly. She did not call her parents. If you have ever been the one your family wrote off, the one they assumed had nothing to offer, leave a comment below. Tell me what that felt like. You are not imagining it, and you are not alone. Public Reckoning, the Hargrove Community Hospital annual gala, was held every October at the Hargrove Civic Center, a building with a ballroom that seated 400 and a history of hosting every significant social occasion the town had produced in 40 years. Diane Ellison had chaired the gala committee for 11 of those years. She considered it her finest civic contribution, and she was not wrong that it was the event of the Hargrove social calendar. The October Gala of 2004 was the occasion the hospital had chosen to announce the completion of its capital campaign and the naming of the new oncology wing. Margaret had known the date for 6 months. She had purchased a table for 8 and invited James Whitfield, Ruth Candela, the hospital's executive director, and 3 colleagues from her professional life. She had not told her parents she would be attending. She arrived before the cocktail hour ended. She wore a dark green dress and the pearl earrings that had belonged to Eleanor. Her hair was up. She moved through the room, and she knew people there, not many, but enough. She greeted the hospital's director and his wife and took her seat. Her parents were at a table near the front, as Diane Ellison always arranged. Claire was with them, and Claire's husband. They did not look in Margaret's direction. They did not know she was there. The dinner proceeded. The salad plates were cleared. The program began. At 10 minutes past 8, the Master of Ceremonies invited Diane Ellison to the podium to introduce the evening's major announcement. Diane was practiced at podiums. She had a voice that carried and a way of pausing before important words to let them land. She thanked the committee. She thanked the community. She said that this evening marked something extraordinary for Hargrove. Then she looked out at the room, and her eyes found a face she did not immediately place, and she said, into the live microphone, in front of 400 people, in the bright, amplified voice of a woman who had never once doubted herself, "Is that Margaret? Did you come to beg for your invitation back?" A few people laughed. Uncertainly, most did not. Margaret did not move. She kept her hands flat on the tablecloth. She looked at her mother evenly and did not speak. The Master of Ceremonies stepped forward and gently took the podium back. He thanked Diane and said that before the major announcement, he wanted to introduce the lead donor of the capital campaign, a woman who had committed $10 million to establish the Eleanor Marsh Oncology Wing, named for her grandmother. He said Margaret Ellison's name. The room was very quiet. Someone set down a fork. The sound was audible. Margaret stood. She walked to the podium. She thanked the hospital's staff, the executive team, and the community that had needed this wing for a long time. She spoke for 4 minutes. Her voice was level. She did not look at her mother or her father or her sister during those 4 minutes. When she was done, she returned to her seat. The room applauded. It was not polite applause. Several people stood. Her mother remained at the table with her program in her hands. The color had gone out of her face. Her father was very still. Claire looked at the tablecloth, which was white. Consequence cascade the weeks that followed arranged themselves without Margaret's involvement. The Columbus business community, in which Margaret had built a quiet reputation over several years, learned about the gift through the hospital's press release. 2 foundations that had been considering her organization for partnership grants moved forward. A board position she had been nominated for and had assumed she would not receive was confirmed by the end of November. In Hargrove, the social calculus shifted in ways Margaret did not witness directly, but heard about through James Whitfield, who had lived in the county for 40 years and knew its rhythms. Diane Ellison was not reappointed to the gala committee the following spring. The vote was close, but it was not in her favor. The charitable committees she had chaired began, quietly, to restructure their leadership. A woman who had been on those committees for 15 years told a mutual acquaintance that Diane's remark from the podium had been the most embarrassing thing she had witnessed at a public event. Robert Ellison retired from the bank in the spring. It was described as his own decision. James mentioned, without elaboration, that the branch's performance review had raised questions about certain account management practices that predated Margaret's situation but had become difficult to ignore. Claire called Margaret twice. Margaret did not answer. She did not block the number. She simply did not answer. Her parents wrote a letter in January. It was 2 pages. Margaret read it once, placed it in the fireproof box where she kept Eleanor's business card, and did not respond. She did not file any legal action. She did not speak to the press. She did not post anything on any platform. She went to work. She met with Ruth every quarter. She wrote a check in Eleanor's name to the university library where Eleanor had volunteered for 20 years. The dominoes fell at their own pace, in their own direction, according to laws that Margaret had not written. Resolution seen the following Thanksgiving. Margaret hosted dinner for the first time in her small house on the east side of Columbus. 8 people came. Ruth Candela brought sweet potato pie from a recipe she had been refining for 30 years. James Whitfield's wife, Helen, arrived with chrysanthemums in a mason jar and a bottle of wine she had been saving for a particular occasion. 2 colleagues from Margaret's office brought their respective partners. A woman named Sylvia, who had been Margaret's graduate school advisor and who had sent a handwritten note when the hospital announcement ran in the paper, came by herself and brought a loaf of bread still warm from her oven. The table was second-hand oak, long enough that Margaret had to borrow 2 chairs from the kitchen. The tablecloth did not match the napkins. The centerpiece was a glass bowl of gourds that Margaret had bought at a farm stand for $6. The mismatched chairs were, she would reflect later, exactly right. They ate for 2 hours. The bread was still faintly warm when they started. Outside, the November light fell through the window in the way it does in late afternoon, long and amber, the kind of light that makes everything look considered. At some point near the end of the meal, James Whitfield raised his glass and said that Eleanor Marsh would have been very pleased. Margaret thought that was probably true. She could almost feel the weight of one of those long, careful letters in her hands. The careful cursive, the genuine questions, the envelope tucked into the lining of a winter coat on a Christmas afternoon 30 years ago. The room was warm. The bread was gone. Outside, the light was going. She said, quietly, that she was grateful. That was all. It was enough. Closing sermon. If you are watching this and you recognize something in Margaret's story, if there is a table you were not seated at, a room where someone told a story of your family that did not include you, a door that closed while you were still learning who you were, then I want to say something to you directly. You were not wrong about what you experienced. The people who minimized you were not seeing clearly. That is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of what they were able to see. There are a few things Margaret's story gives us permission to hold on to. You are allowed to leave quietly. You do not owe anyone a scene. The absence of confrontation is not weakness. It is a form of self-preservation that the people who wronged you will not understand, and that is fine. You are allowed to build something they cannot take. What Eleanor gave Margaret was not only money, it was the knowledge that someone had seen her, had planned for her, had believed in her future when the people closest to her were not looking. That kind of legacy does not require wealth to exist. It requires witness. You are allowed to let consequences arrive on their own. You do not need to manage the fallout. You do not need to ensure that justice is seen to be done. The truth has a weight of its own, and it lands in its own time. You are allowed to set a table for the people who showed up. The family you choose is still family. The meal still nourishes. The light through the window is still real. If this story reached something in you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you are carrying. I read every one. You were never penniless. Always worth more than they could count.